Everybody online, I'll be monitoring the online chat. So if you need, if you want to ask a question at the end, just type it in there and I'll be sure to be your voice. I'm excited to have Dr. Eve Manz here. She's an associate professor, right? At Boston University in the Wheelock School of Education. Eve is one of my favorite scholars in this field, and one of my, I think, the most fluid writers, and also someone who just has incredible ideas. So I was really excited when she said yes to coming to share those with us. She also has a new book out on science investigations at the elementary level, and this afternoon at 2:20 down in 190, she's going to be doing a workshop for a few different classes of elementary majors. So very excited. We'll have time for questions at the end. So feel free to keep track of them and we'll have plenty of time. And otherwise, thanks for coming, Eve.
Thank you for having me. I am really excited to be here. Ron is a person I consider as very friendly and supportive within the field. And by sort of extension, I've decided all of you are too. And so I've actually developed a new talk on some newer practices I'm using, trying to get a handle on some stuff I think I've been trying to use for a long time, and just get more crisp in my ways of talking about it, and also see what those ideas do for others. So I'm here to talk with you about working with the maple seed. You'll start to see what that means, but particularly around this idea of functional emergence in our work in design and analysis. And I'm going to talk you through why I'm using this idea of functional emergence, how I'm trying to use it, and then see what you all think of it and what work it might do for you in designing and analyzing learning environments. And I'm going to take a second and move one thing. Okay, so before I start, I should acknowledge the work I'm presenting on is not just my work. I owe a large debt of gratitude to the teachers and children, to the district leaders, and then 3 doctoral students who've been very much engaged in this work, one of whom is done and out in the field, Annabelle Stoller, as well as Janelle Diaz-Silvera and Suhaila Nassar. So I'm going to start the talk, since I'm in a Department of Teaching and Learning, by taking you into a classroom to look at what's happening. And I'll continue to use this example as a touch point throughout the talk to make sense of the design and analysis ideas. So we're going to step into a 2nd grade classroom, which is one of my favorite places to be. The 2nd graders that we're going to be watching and thinking about have gone outside with their teacher to examine the plants around them. It is fall, and seeds are coming off of those plants. So one of the kinds of plants they're observing is a maple tree, which is very common in the eastern part of this country. Tall trees, everyone probably knows what the maple leaf looks like. And a maple samara looks like this. So the seed of the maple tree is actually located in that wing-like structure. Have folks seen these before? I'm trying to get myself used to this for the elementary pre-service teachers this afternoon and not over a Zoom. Okay, oh good, that's really helpful, great. So one group of students has gotten particularly interested in this maple seed, and you did this kind of twirling motion, and so they have experiences with it twirling. The class has started talking about why the seeds of plants might need to get to new places, and then how they do. And so they've talked about how seeds could travel by sticking to animals, by being pushed by the wind, maybe floating, maybe twirling, by being eaten and pooped out, which is always fun. And so at this point, the teacher introduces a video of different ways that seeds travel by wind. The children have, I should say, they've made predictions about how they think their seed travels best. And now they're starting a series of investigations to explore their ideas, to see if they're right, to see how their seed travels. And so when they begin to investigate wind, they watch a video of seeds traveling in different ways by wind, and they start to look really closely at the parts of different seeds that help them travel by wind. So the dandelion has this thing that looks like a parachute. The cottonwood tree has all of this fluff. And then they're noticing that other seeds have things like wings, but they've noticed they might help them fly in different ways. So they've talked about gliding, they've talked about twirling. And then the teacher supports them to develop an investigation, to take their seeds inside, because it's really hard to just sit around outside and wait till those seeds travel and see if they travel by wind. And so she says, well, how could we use what we have in the classroom to test whether our seeds are good wind travelers? She brings in a fan. She says, how can we use this to help us study how our seeds would travel outside? And children decide, with her support, to hold the seeds up in front of the fan. They have a paper in front of them. And so they're seeing if the seed will travel off of their hand and how far on the paper it goes. There's always excitement. The kids are yelling like, go maple seed, go maple seed. And then the maple seed drops to the ground. And this happens in classroom after classroom. Students are usually, tend to start thinking like, you sort of hear them at the end kind of excitedly going back to their seats, and they're immediately beginning to think, well, like, why didn't it? And they often will start thinking about why the things they did indoors are not really like the outdoors. The teacher, Nora, who we're about to look at, has heard this talk. She's seen that kids have gone to journals where they're writing a claim. Now I think my seed does or does not travel by wind. And she's seen a lot of the maple seed children have written unsure, which is always an option on our student sheets, or that they have disagreement. So, oh yeah, there's where the maple seed is, way at that left end of the paper. And the other seeds have traveled far to the end. So Nora brings the students together. Different groups present how they think their seed travels. They think their seed is a good wind traveler and why they think so. And she's purposely put the maple seed group last. So groups like the milkweed have agreed that their seed is a good wind traveler. They've used as evidence that it went really far. The berry group has said, we do not think our seed is a good wind traveler. And they've talked about why that is. And now we're going to look at what happens when the maple seed group begins to present. We're going to think about what we see. So now I have to do a little switcheroo. Maybe Ron, you can monitor to see if this works online. We're going to, okay. Okay. Oh yeah, and so I should say that what the class then decides to do with the teacher's help is they decide they need a new test. You heard the beginning of that, like, well, we don't have a ladder. And she says, well, how could we get it as high? They're saying they want to get it as high as the tree. And they realize with her help that they can drop it out a second floor window. And I always just love this moment when they do go and drop a maple seed, which they've seen twirling outside of a second floor window. Oh, wait. Oh, dude, you can do it. Okay. Let's try it. Well, I'll try it one more time. Sorry, I always forget, like, the volume has to be anything we've done to turn the volume up so you can hear the kids in the classroom. It needs to be turned down before they go outside so they don't blow our eardrums up. But right, that's a good sign. So what I'm gonna have you do is do a brief reflection. We'll do this quickly, but I think it's useful to get talking. Just do a quick turn and talk 2 to 3 minutes with folks at your table. What is something you value that you saw students doing or experiencing? And what design elements can you sort of see aspects of the design of instruction that you think supported that? So just do a quick discussion. Okay, I'm gonna bring folks back together. Rather than having you share out, because I know myself well enough to know if you start talking back about what you value, I will start talking back, and then we'll spend the whole time talking about what just happened in that classroom and not the research behind it. So I'm gonna ask you to hold on to those ideas, and hopefully I'll be able to touch back on them, and we'll come back to them at the end. So what I'm gonna do now that we have this shared image is I'm gonna take you back out to the research context, and then I'm gonna explain some of the research questions and approaches that got us here and that we're using to try to understand what was going on in that classroom. So the video that you saw is part of a 7-year grant that was focused on developing and testing science investigations, working with 2nd and 5th grade teachers. So you saw an example of one of our 2 classroom investigations for 2nd grade. We also developed several for 5th grade. With the idea that we would engage with teachers in co-designing and making sense of investigations so that we could share tools, approaches, curriculum materials, both with their district and then beyond. So the district the teachers are working in is a small, urban, linguistically, socioeconomically, racially diverse district. They were working to implement new science standards at the time, which was part of their buy-in for engaging in this grant. And it was a self-selected group of teachers and district leaders who chose to take part in the project. So the instructional context that I work in that really made a difference, I think, in getting some buy-in from the district and then how the materials are getting taken up was a movement in science education to start focusing science education on students using and applying knowledge through engaging in practices like those that scientists and engineers engage in. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the science standards, here are the 8 science and engineering practices that districts were trying to move students toward engaging in. And in particular, 2 of the practices that we were really targeting and that I think show up especially in the example that you just watched and the investigation I'll focus on today are constructing explanations. So students beginning to explain how and why things happen that they see in the world. How exactly does a seed get to a new place? Why might it need to get to a new place? And then engaging in argument from evidence. And this is where you see children doing things like saying, I think now that the seed travels in this way, I agree because, I disagree because, what can we do to agree? What new evidence can we collect? So these were 2 of the practices that we were really focusing with teachers on designing for. So now, today, and this is where it gets a little new for me, what I want to do is zero in on an idea that was really central to our work in both designing these investigations and then analyzing them as researchers. And that's this idea of functional emergence. So I'm going to introduce the idea of functional emergence. I'll tie it back to the example that we just saw. Then I'll consider what exactly a functionally emergent approach to design-based research, which is the kind of research I engage in, might look like. I'll share findings briefly, and then I'm going to try to invite some discussion and musing about the possibilities of this idea, improving it for my practice, and maybe it's useful for yours. So what do I mean by functional emergence? I'm going to start with a quote from Charles Bazerman, who this idea is drawn from. He wrote, by identifying certain regularities as characteristic of scientific language, or we could say scientific practice, or we could say any practice, linguists have given the impression that these regularities are timeless expressions of the essential character of science. And he writes, instead, we must account for the functional emergence of such regularities to understand what they are and what they do. So the context in which Bazerman developed this idea is a book he wrote about the history of the experimental scientific article. So the sort of article in which scientists say, this is what's known, this is not known, here's the controlled experiment that I have done, now I know this. So this is seen really as paradigmatic of science activity. It's the basis of the lab report that we all had to write in high school. And what Bazerman's doing in the book is he's showing how each of the features of that scientific experimental article actually emerged over time as scientists were arguing with each other, disagreeing with each other, having new instruments. And so he's really saying, look, this isn't like something that is just a essential form of science. It's a structure and a strategy that's used to solve problems and meet agreed on criterias for evidence. And so for me, this idea is really consistent with sociocultural notions of practices, which I take up in my work. So I see any practices that scientists or children are engaged in as emergent from some sort of shared enterprise. They're located in something a group of people are trying to do. They're enacted in and they kind of make up the culture or world of that place. And they're always accomplished in specific settings. So what I have done and found really useful is to take these ideas from Bazerman and to use them to try to think about what's the difference between a timeless expression approach to designing instructional settings and then a functionally emergent approach. So here's my description of a timeless expression approach to designing or analyzing instructional settings. So many instructional approaches do something where designers or educators would distill experts' activity into a well-described structure that can be taught explicitly to young people. So then the aim is to help students like adopt that form, support a claim with evidence and reasoning of this kind. Introduction tends to then we sort of move toward like, okay, so what's the like, how do we introduce that form? What's the rule or process we can describe? How can we give young people an example of what it looks like? How can we model it? And then how can we make it easy for them to do that thing? So how do we lessen the demands for them of doing that? And then we tend to compare what they did to the form that we want. So in contrast, a functionally emergent approach that's informed by sociocultural theory treats practices that we want students to engage in as embedded in local classroom cultures and starts by saying, okay, so like, what's the function? What does this do for scientists in their culture? If that function is important, how would we design this instructional setting to make that function obvious? So how do we first establish the need for the thing that we want students to do? And then how do we give them some agency, some flexibility, some creativity in how they engage in the practice in light of that function? So we focus on understanding functions, we create contexts in which those functions are sensible, and then we develop explanations of what young people do as they are coming up against that function. So we could look at that video that I showed you earlier from both those perspectives. A timeless expression approach or lens would tend to look at, did children, did they have a claim? Did they back it up with evidence from the investigation? So that first student, M, who says, I do not think the maple seed travels by wind, it did not fall far. We would have a sort of like claim evidence structure in her thinking. And we'd look at, had the teacher taught that claim evidence structure? Had she modeled it? Are all students using that claim evidence structure in their talk? If we look at the if we take a functional emergence approach, and this is what I heard all of you kind of starting to do as you talked with each other, you start saying, well, like, why? What was the problem? What was going on that students were starting to make sense of? And what we see is in this case, the fact that the maple seed had done something unexpected and that they disagreed about how to make sense of that spurred discussion in which new ideas became sensible and important, and they started critiquing the investigation, right? They started critiquing the investigation as providing useful evidence, and needing a new investigation. And so we're really focusing there on like, well, what was the function for them of each of those actions? Why did they start to disagree with each other? Why did they bring up that idea of height? How did they decide, with the teacher's help, the need to do a new investigation? And these are really, I'd argue, and I'm about to go into this, that those kind of functions that they engaged with, disagreeing with each other, making sense of how an investigation is like or not like the thing you're trying to represent, those are central functions in science activity. And so that makes me happy that they were doing that. That's what I tend to look at. Now, just to be clear, because this can be a misunderstanding when I say this, I am not saying that I think we only need a functionally emergent approach to design. I think both understanding the forms that disciplinary experts use and understanding the functions is helpful, but I tend to privilege the functions and use the form in light of those functions. Does that make sense? So this is where I've introduced this approach. I'm gonna now try briefly to explain how I enact this approach within science. This is the tricky part of the talk, because there's a lot I could say about science. So I'm trying out some ways of being brief in doing that, but I'm certainly happy to answer questions about this part too. But for me, when I start designing for functional emergence within science instruction, even for elementary students, I see uncertainty as key to a functional emergence approach. And I have two rationales for that. So one, uncertainty is inherent to science activity. Many folks will say science is fundamentally the act of managing and coming to agreement in light of uncertainty. Scientists are not uncertain just about how to explain the world, but they're uncertain about how to develop an investigation that represents the world, how to measure things, how to define variables, how to make sense of noisy data. So throughout the science process, there are many places where uncertainty drives science practice. Just always like to put a plug in for this book that just came out this year by Maggie Jackson, in which she's trying to look at the way uncertainty functions both in science and human activity. And then the second point I'll make is that uncertainty supports engagement and conceptual progress for all of us, scientists or non-scientists. So psychological research has shown that toddlers will play for longer with toys that have ambiguous mechanisms, and they'll actually play more strategically if they'll sort of use their play to try to figure out how toys work. And so from the earliest stages, for all of us, the feeling of not knowing or not being able to make something work cues us to pay attention and to try out additional strategies. So in the design work that I do, what I'm fundamentally trying to do is use uncertainty as a resource to support students to meaningfully engage in those science practices that I named in the standards. And by uncertainty, I kind of mean anything not obvious. I mean puzzles, I mean disagreement, I mean things where I see one thing and you see another, decisions we have to make. And I have a diagram up here that just points out, this is the seeds investigation the children did, but that there's uncertainty that can come up for them at many aspects of that process as they move from that outside phenomenon to that fan investigation in the classroom, to thinking about how to make sense of, how to track and make sense of what happened when the seeds landed, and all the way back out to where we saw them, to like, well, what does it mean that we saw the maple seed did not fall far, and how do we explain how the maple seed travels? So that is, that's the basis of the idea. And now what I'm going to do is talk about how we've tried to take that idea that's really been useful for our design and apply that to design-based research methods. I'm gonna share this briefly and hopefully still leave time for talking. And we have till 10:30, right, Ron? Okay. Can I just see how many folks in this room are familiar with design-based research? So this is kind of the primary methodology that I use in my research, and I tend to define it for folks who are newer to it as a form of research in which you're simultaneously designing something and studying it at the same time, both to understand a new form of learning as well as the means to support it. And you're typically taking learning to occur in a complex system. And so when you design, you're basically like making guesses about what you value and under what conditions it emerges. I'm sort of making guesses about how to think about science practices in elementary settings and under what conditions those are going to be meaningful. And then you're examining, rather than sort of doing a control of variables logic where you're looking at two different interventions, you're looking across multiple iterations in which you probably redesigned. And you're trying to explain how the design went differently and what that helps you understand about key design principles and features. And so in this case, what I'm trying to fundamentally understand is both elementary children's science practice and investigations, and then the feature of the environment that supports those. And I'm going to kind of skip this diagram from Grabmeier and Cobb. So design-based research was the primary method that we used across multiple years in working with teachers on various investigations. I'm going to focus just on this seeds travel investigation, and I'm going to focus just on one part of it, which was children's investigation of how seeds travel by wind. So we began in 2018 working with 3 second grade teachers who'd been thinking about uncertainty with us, and we started by making some conjectures about what kinds of uncertainty might be useful to put into this investigation, and then what instructional practices would support children to engage in science practices as they came across those uncertainties, and also to deepen their explanations of seed travel. We then did analysis together. We redesigned the investigation, 2 teachers, some similar, 4 teachers, some similar, some different to the first year. Did the investigation in 2019. We then hit COVID and various things happened. We did this by Zoom. We tried it out in little ways as we came back, but we did like a sort of more concerted final iteration in 2022, really focusing in on 2 teachers who've been working with us the longest to see how to put some of the design principles we'd learned in place. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about what it looks like to really put uncertainty, to operationalize uncertainty within a functionally emergent approach. And I'm going to tell you how we're doing that, and I'll show you how it plays out in analysis. So first, we're designing for uncertainty, right? So we want to acknowledge that we as designers are making bets about the kinds of uncertainty that are going to be productive for children or learners to encounter, and then the outcomes that we're going to support through that. I use the idea of emergence and complex systems to think that like we're going to have to design for multiple interacting actors and materials. And then we're focusing our design efforts on making functions of the practice visible. And then at the same time, if we want to understand how those design bets play out, we need methods for understanding uncertainty as experienced in the learning environment. And this is where we spent a bunch of our last few years. So we take uncertainty to be both an individual and a collective phenomenon. That can be an individual child saying, you know, I'm not sure, or why does this happen? But uncertainty can occur in a collective, even if 2 people are sure, if they're disagreeing. So individual, 1 person, a collective of folks who disagree or are doing different things. When we look at uncertainty as emergent and experienced for students, we've come to see that playing out in 3 ways. And so 1, we want to think about whether that uncertainty was actually realized in the learning environment. We designed for uncertainty to occur. Did students experience uncertainty? So that occurs for us in that moment when the student sees what happens in front of the fan and is going, well, like, I'm not sure, or like, it did not fly, but I actually think it does outside. So those are indicators for us that uncertainty is realized. If we want that uncertainty to do work in classroom learning environments, we've also come to see that it needs to be made public. So is there a chance for that uncertainty that an individual is experiencing to actually get made public, to get sort of put out to the class? We saw that in the video when the teacher says, oh, is everyone in agreement? And we hear no. So now we have public uncertainty. And then that uncertainty could or might not shape further activity, right? The teacher could choose at that moment to say, well, this, or the teacher could choose, as we saw here, that to open that up to discussion, in which case we think there's opportunity for this productive practice, and we follow how that happens. So we've operationalized uncertainty in our data as, is it realized? Is it made public? And then does and how does it shape further activity? And we want those, we use those to feed back into each other. So, with this in mind, here's how we look for this in our data, and then I'll still have time to share some findings for that. I'm gonna focus on like the big top question. So the research question we're trying to address is, how can we use design-based research methods to develop, test, and refine design principles for functional emergence of meaningful science practices, as well as conceptual progress through students experiencing uncertainty? And then focusing on those first two sub-questions, how do design choices influence how children and teachers experience and take up uncertainty? And how do design choices influence how they work with that uncertainty toward meaningful science practice and conceptual progress? To understand this across what is about 200 hours of video data, here is the process that we came up with. So what we did is we selected 2 teachers' implementations for each of those 3 years that I showed you. So 2 of the teachers who actually basically had the most video data and had taken the investigation all the way through. We had content logged all of that data from those classrooms. We videotaped almost every lesson. We had field notes, we had artifacts, we had student work. And we began to develop conjectures about how uncertainty was emerging and the work it was doing. And then we pursued multiple rounds of data analysis to check those conjectures. One aspect of that was getting clear on design changes and whether they were actually implemented. So we spent some time looking at how we had changed the design between each of those implementations. And then for each of those design changes, understanding what was its rationale, and did we see that change actually implemented for each teacher that we were looking at, or was it, or had it actually in fact been implemented earlier than we thought? So we looked at, was that choice evident, that design choice in each teacher's work? Then we have developed a method of logging and analyzing uncertainty. So we actually look at all of the video data through these logs that we've developed. And we actually look across all the data to see, is there evidence that uncertainty was realized? Do we see disagreement, discussion, hedging, students saying, well, maybe, but maybe not? We look to see, was that uncertainty made public? So we look at each whole group discussion. And actually, this is an example of our log for a whole group discussion. So we look at each uncertainty that was brought up. We look at, does a teacher or student bring it up, and how? What's the response? Do people just move on, or does the teacher invite further conversation? And then in light of that, what indicators are there that that uncertainty is doing something productive for the practices we care about, for investigation and explanation? And so each of these documents per teacher is like 15 to 20 pages. This part takes a while. Our content logging really helps us do this, and we have undergrads help us with that. But this is like a labor of love and interest that a grad student and I have been engaged in for the last few months. So just being clear about that. And then we memo, developing process-oriented explanations to link these together. And we're interested in predictability. So are the same forms of uncertainty coming up again and again in each classroom? Are kids experiencing uncertainty about the maple seed? Are they making it public? And then what's happening? So we're interested in that predictability. And we're also interested in variability. When it goes differently in different classrooms, can we try to explain why? So I am going to, from there, show a plan, just a very brief snapshot of findings. And then I'm going to focus more on the musings and hear more from you. So at a brief snapshot, what did we find when we engaged in this process across all of these 3 implementations? So we found that in the first year, we could see that the uncertainty was coming up. So uncertainty was realized. Students were dissatisfied with numerous seeds and what they did, or unsure about whether the test was a good test. But they tended to occur in moments, and they tended to not elicit very much explanation in particular. Students did not go much deeper into explaining why and how the maple seed travels as a result of the uncertainty they experienced. And as one teacher who is shown here reflected on it at the end of our first investigation, she said, well, students had fun investigating. I think they learned a lot about investigating, but they didn't really learn anything new about seeds. She did not feel that their explanations deepened as a result of the uncertainty that they were engaging in. So it was like the first steps of emergence were there of the uncertainty, but it wasn't doing work. In response, we tried a number of design changes, 2 of which I'll highlight in a second. And then we found over time that when we basically narrowed choices and uncertainty, focused on the maple seed as a seed that had a lot of potential for explanation, and increased the resources in the classroom, we were always going a step further. So routinely in classrooms, kids would not only be dissatisfied with the maple seed, but they'd start to mention differences in the outside, and they'd start to talk about height somewhere. And height is really important for that explanation because it needs that fall in order to start doing your twirly motion. And so, right, we could see that predictably, kids were both uncertain and beginning to explain. And then what happened with that and how, there was still substantial variability across implementations. And so we focused our later work on explaining that variability. So one thing that we've really begun to think about a lot is strategic selection of uncertainty. So we've been able to develop, we think, much more robust principles we can share with teachers for don't include all forms of uncertainty, but be strategic. And we have developed prediction questions. Here's how you can predict what kinds of uncertainty will be productive in a given investigation. And so particularly in this investigation, we saw that again and again, the maple seed was the most predictable, useful focus for kids' disagreement. And so we've come to build that in more, use more time for the maple seed, engage with it last. Another key thing that this has enabled us to really see, and this is especially in that variability around years 2 and 3, is that the more physical and visual resources the teacher leaves up in the classroom for kids to use, the deeper they're going to go in explanation. And so by the end of our time, this teacher, Lauren, who's been working with us the longest, and we have a whole page on her use of resources in the book, she'd have her charts up all around her. And as kids were talking, you'd see them moving back and forth between the seed structures chart, the chart on which the results were shown. And then we learned especially to always have a slide available behind the kids that had both a picture of the parent plant and a picture of the seeds. And the kids would start to use this, and it would keep that outside phenomenon much more in their heads to be engaging with the difference between the inside and the outside. So this is a key learning that method of functional emergence really allowed us to see. So from there, I'll just say briefly, this enabled us to develop a list of design strategies for incorporating uncertainty, which we've then been able to put on our website and apply across more investigations. And so I can kind of stop there with some additional findings and continued musings, and then would love questions and your all's thought. So one is, I think, right, this idea of being able to say that there's predictability in what students are going to experience uncertainty about, and then what the potential of that uncertainty is really important. That feels really important to me as an instructional design principle idea, because of course we know, and we see it with our teachers too, that if teachers kind of have a sense of the conceptual terrain and the possibilities of something they're teaching, they're that much more aware. They know what to listen for. They know what to kind of nurture within it. And so that predictably we can get this uncertainty to come up, and that we can name for teachers, look, if you do some work with this, children will start to critique the investigation, and they'll start to talk about these ecological ideas of the relationship between a seed and its parent plant, these mechanisms around height and twirling. I will offer this caution, and I think this is a really interesting thing to explore within this idea of functional emergence, right? Which is like, we have some evidence from our instantiations, and I found myself doing this too, that like once you know what uncertainty might come up, you can sometimes get into the mindset of like manufacturing it or sort of doing it ahead of the kids. And so you can sort of like start to say like, oh, the height, right? Like before the kids are ready. And so we've all kind of had to learn to think about that. Like, how are we still present in the children's emergent experience while also guiding and using their ideas as resources? And that's actually been a really fruitful conversation with teachers as well. As many of you mentioned at your tables, but I didn't cover in this talk, teachers' discourse moves are really important for this work. And so we've developed tools that look at key discourse moves for different kinds of conversations around uncertainty. And then we've also come to see, especially in older grades, that the role of kids' relations to each other and their sense of risk is really important. So in the 5th grade, we learned that we really needed to talk about and think about, like, what does it mean for you to be uncertain? What does it mean that this is a class in which disagreement is great for the development of our knowledge? And Annabelle Stoller, her dissertation was on this, and she has papers on this. We have some papers under review, so it's a new focus for us to talk about. So with that in mind, any questions, comments, ideas about how this could be helpful to you? I put up like some kind of reflections I'd love to hear from you, but I also want to make sure there's space for you all to ask me questions. So just open it up to either.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Or, sorry, someone else? Well, thank you. This is super interesting. There was a question that kept coming into my head as you were talking, starting at about when you started talking more specifically about uncertainty. And it might be connected to the very last point on your last slide, but I don't know. But the question for me that kept emerging around uncertainty, particularly among children, really has to do with identities and positionalities. And I guess I'm curious if your research has looked into or considered the ways in which not just experiencing uncertainty, but vocalizing uncertainty might appear, look, sound different for different kids, particularly depending on race, class, gender, ability, etc. So
yeah, and this is something, so again, because we do this was not something that was an initial research question, but because we take this approach to joint learning with teachers, which is basically like they, with us, develop the questions and the design principles, ideas, I'd say we have engaged with this idea less around, there could be 2 ways to interpret this. Like, are there cultural differences or like cultural practices that children are bringing in that we could start to predict that may make uncertainty like more or less usual, uncomfortable, vulnerable? I'd say that's not an idea that we've engaged with as directly, other than trying to be very clear for everyone about like the framings for why uncertainty, and allowing multiple ways into showing uncertainty. And so one thing that we've done is develop designs that have like uncertainty across multiple different modes of participation. So every worksheet the children see from the beginning of the year always has a check box, a box for like, I'm not sure. We never ask children to make a claim without having like, I think this, or I think the opposite, or I'm not yet sure. So one thing is like building it into the material of the classroom from the beginning. But then I'd say the second place it's in second grade, yes, but especially in fifth grade that we really saw and that teachers really pushed us on was their perceived sense of how uncertainty was playing out within status and vulnerability in the classroom. And so what does it mean if children have had 4 years of learning to like judge their own and each other's academic status and identity based on ideas of like who's sure, who has this a certain vocabulary, and that children have relationships that they're navigating outside of like the public work they're doing, like of this kind that you and I are doing. So, and that's what Annabelle's dissertation looks at within fifth grade. She actually looks at all the different ways that teachers and students navigated this. So she studied teachers, she interviewed students about their experiences. And in fifth grade especially, we actually took to using a version of the student experience survey, asking kids like, what kinds of things did you feel today? Did you share an idea? If not, why not? And we'd actually put up the data anonymously for the kid. The teachers would put up the data anonymously with the kids, and the kids would start to explain it. And they would then think about, well, like, to what extent do we want unsureness and uncertainty? What does it mean that not everyone in this classroom feels valued? What does it mean that people felt frustrated in science today? Is that okay? So they had to make that like a regular part of their classroom practice. And in the book, we have an entire chapter on classroom culture and what we learned about that. So sorry, that was another one I can go on for a long time about.
A lot of comments on the chat.
Oh, sorry.
But it's not a question, I'll.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So within the space, within the context of the schools that you were working in, when you discovered that the maple seed was kind of a point of, uncertainty, and however the children didn't really seem to learn more about the maple seed, did those schools have like the space, like time and space to make decisions moving forward that like, okay, now we can go and investigate more deeply and look at the seed under a microscope or, whatever. Did they have that opportunity, or was it more of a structured curriculum?
So the way that we set this up was, and we, again, I think I was pretty lucky in when and how I got to do this work at a time when districts were figuring out what the new standards meant, and there weren't yet enough research-based materials out there that had caught up with the new standards. So we had an arrangement with the district that we were doing the research to understand how this played out. So this was a pilot year in which only those 2 to 3 teachers had been given time by the district to try it out. So it was like more experimental. And then the idea was, we need you to help us know when it's productive and what it will take to make this productive for other teachers before we roll this out to the rest of the district, if that makes sense. And so that I think allowed like that depth of engagement that you need to say, because once you get to that, you're like, well, should we throw the whole thing out? Is this a waste of our time, or is this worth our time to improve this? And we were lucky in that we'd really set it up so that the teachers working with us kind of knew they were trying this out, and they felt accountable to it ultimately being useful to other teachers in the district.
That kind of makes me think of a question about the challenges you might have seen in allowing teachers to allow the students to be uncertain. You had a bullet point about that, like not jumping in and saying the answer, right? And I'm thinking about it in particular from the stance of teacher education. In this post in GSS, now we're like bought it, whatever. Now we're trying to train teachers. Do you have any insights on that? Was that a big challenge?
Yeah, and so the way it's actually similar. I have a little slide about this that I didn't have time for. But so it's actually similar in that we've learned to say to teachers, and the teachers and we really tried to figure out how to write the materials like this. Now this is hard, like I don't think we've got this right, but I think it's really hard. But this is the principle we've adopted, is that the materials themselves should show what the value to you is of doing this work, and should allow flexibility in how you do it, and should ideally prevent you from getting so lost you ended up figuring out, like deciding it wasn't useful. So I'm actually gonna talk with the pre-service teachers about this a
Yeah.
little bit. But we would do things in professional development, like we would really show the rationale for a specific kind of uncertainty, but then we'd actually pause the video before a teacher responded, and we'd have everyone in the room discuss what are a few different responses. Because we don't usually think there's like one right response, and even the teachers who've done this for a while, I check in with them like year by year, and visit them, and they'll have years where they won't go as far in the maple seed. They'll have years where they'll show a video at the end instead of going back and dropping it off a second story window, or, you know, just like,
Yeah.
it just is different every year. And so we've said, you know, the key idea is like, how can you recognize the value of uncertainty? How can you honor it and not just cut it off, but also there's no, you know, we often will give options, but like, yes, I've learned not to make this design itself too fragile. And like there's only, you know, one way you have to do it too. So it's kind of like the same kind of thing.
Question from Joelle online, she'll be at lunch, so you can talk more about it. I'm curious about how you may have explored the ideas of the functional learning approach and design-based research transfer and other science concepts. It may take a bit of time to identify points of uncertainty in particular concepts.
Yes, I would love to talk. I'm happy to talk further about that. We have a whole process we've developed that we've taken a few groups of teachers and district leaders through for how do you, like, what can it look like when you're looking at an investigation you have either taught before or that you're designing, and identify and design for it. And so we do have a set of approaches and a tool that we're trying to get out on the website. And we've learned it's like hard, and we think there are some things we can name within it.
Could you talk a little bit more about the role of the kids' developmental progression and accepting uncertainty? You know, I mean, second graders for sure, they're gonna, you know, very playful and fun. And then you said the fifth graders are starting to be concerned about, you know, their status and role in their classroom ecosystem.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering about how you envision this idea of uncertainty mapping with developmental progression.
Yeah, I think I would need to engage with more high school teachers to understand it, because it's like, I don't think, because I'm a design-based researcher, I always think about it as like a design challenge. So I feel like there's different design challenges in this, in like second, fifth, middle school, high school. And so my approach that I'd love to have high school folks work on, and Ron could probably talk about this as well, because I know he's implemented these ideas and ideas like them in high school. But my approach would always be, it's like, well, what would a design context be in which students would experience real uncertainty and experience that as productive? And what other aspects of the setting would need to be in place for that to be productive? And I'd be like working on those at once. And I would imagine in high school, right, the challenges are they're just gonna be somewhat different, because sometimes it can take a real effort in second grade for us to come up with like, what's this uncertainty that's like accessible to the kids? Like, we have to really learn from the kids about this one. And we usually do a much more open kind of first investigation, because second graders will let us do that with them. And then we collect like everything they argued about, puzzled about, worried about. And then we start to say like, well, if we went further with this, how could it be helpful? So with second graders, it's like, we're not in the position as adults to know what they're uncertain about always. So that's the design challenge. And then, I'd imagine with fifth, you know, again, the higher you get, the more it would be around both like some of the technological black boxing of the instrumentation and stuff they work with. And then also around kind of like cultural norms. I will say I have heard my 7th and 8th grade son saying to his friends by FaceTime when he didn't know I was there that the problem with their science instruction is there's not enough uncertainty. It's like, you know, such a like satisfying one. Like, but my mom read a book about this, and you just don't understand. Mr. Page just like doesn't give us any uncertainty. It's like, okay, so So, yeah. Yeah.
So what are some examples of unproductive uncertainty that you see?
That's such a great question. And so what we found is when there's like so many different ideas and ways of doing things that people cannot actually engage with each other, like everyone's just saying many different things, and the teacher doesn't like hear things coalescing that they can do something with, and or well, the other side of it too that we always think about is like, are you gonna get somewhere by engaging in this? And so we typically think very hard about like the resources we'll provide once students have experienced the uncertainty and what kinds of resources they need to work through it. So we have found like unproductive uncertainty, it doesn't have to be defined by the fact that like you can't work through it on your own. Because what we've found is if kids experience uncertainty and engage in that argumentation, and then we say bring in a book from a science perspective that explains the thing, and we frame it right. This is in the pre-service work this afternoon. I don't have this slide here, but if we say like, we're gonna read this book that's gonna give us more information, how does it connect to your ideas? It's like that uncertainty can still be productive because it set them up to think there was a problem. So it doesn't have to be that they like have to work through it on their own, but it does have to be that like we have in mind resources that will help them work through it. Does that make sense? So it's kind of, yeah, it's like both. I think that those would be the top two I'd name is like, does the conversation start to go somewhere? And are there resources to work through it? And a third would be, is it conceptually related to something that's important? So those are the three we tend to design for.
Right, we are at
Okay.
time. Thank you very much, Eve.
Thank you all.
And we can hang out a few minutes before we head over to the ELDC.
Yeah, and I will say, I think I have a last slide about the book, but that is what's in the book.
I need to get a new copy. My dog decided the edge of your book was looking very delicious. I'll be getting a new one here soon.
All the doctoral students have toddlers at this point, and they're like toddlers, really. Like we have a lot of pictures of the toddlers also like chewing on the book. And Annabelle was saying she kept trying to give her daughter a board book. She was like, no, I want this one.
Uh,
Yes.
I think it's cool that it's